It looks like we have quite a few people joining us today. I'd like to thank everyone for joining our final webinar, Lessons Learned from the Frontline. I am Chrissy Grove, Director of Professional Services here at Dragos, and I will be your moderator today. I've been with Dragos for about 2.5 years, and I come from 20 years of experience working on and leading teams focused on OT cybersecurity. And today we're going to be having an awesome roundtable discussion from members across our professional services team, where each of them will share their personal experiences in 2022 from the front lines of industrial cybersecurity and the key lessons that they've learned. But before we get started, I do have a couple of things, housekeeping items. So today's session is being recorded, and we will email the recording out to everyone after we've completed. Your microphones have been muted, but we still would like you to interact with us. So down at the bottom, you'll see a Q&A feature. You can submit any questions you have there, and we'll try to get to all of your questions before the end of the webinar. And lastly, I hope that you've been able to join the previous 2022 year in review webinars in the series. If not, both the threat landscape and vulnerability brief webinars are available on demand from our website. So let's go ahead and get this kick started. And I'd like our panelists to introduce themselves. Sumit, would you like to kick us off?
Thanks, Chrissy. My name is Sumit, and I am a senior industrial penetration tester here with the Dragos' professional services team. Here, I am involved in conducting penetration testing and network vulnerability assessments for our OT clients. I have around 12 years of experience performing these assessments previously at a consulting firm. So that's my background. I will pass it over to you, Eric.
Thanks, Sumit, and welcome everybody. I'm Eric Brown. I've been with Dragos for about 5 years as a senior industrial threat hunter with a primary focus in the Dragos OT Watch team. It's a managed threat hunting service where the team and I proactively monitor for new and existing threats in OT environments. Thanks again, and I will pass it over to Marcus.
Yeah, hi, my name's Marcus Mueller. I'm a principal industrial consultant as part of the professional services team here at Dragos. I help customers secure their industrial environments and improve their OT security programs. Before joining Dragos, I spent about 15 years working in the utility space for asset owners with a focus on renewable energy and grid modernization. And I'll pass it to Hussein.
Hello, nice to have all of you on the call. I'm Hussein Vrani. I'm a senior industrial incident responder as part of professional services, specifically within the Threat Operations Center. My background is roughly about 22 years in tech, and it spans digital privacy, forensics, network, law enforcement, and incident response, both in IT and OT. Over to Curtis.
Thanks, Hussein, and welcome everyone. My name is Curtis Schmiller. I am a director here at Dragos as part of the professional services team. I've been with Dragos for nearly a year now, and prior to joining Dragos, I come with 20 years of experience working specifically in the OT cybersecurity industry in a variety of roles, both technical and leadership focused. The last decade or so has been spent focusing on leadership of OT cybersecurity organizations. I thank you all again for attending today. I look forward to the discussion, and I'll turn it back over to Chrissy.
Thank you, Curtis. So today we'll be discussing our key findings from our 2022 year in review. As you probably know, each year Dragos publishes ICS vulnerabilities, threats targeting industrial environments, and industry trends from our customer engagements, offering a glimpse of the state of industrial cybersecurity from our unique vantage point. Our goal has always been to educate and share everything we know back to the community. So this professional services team understands the realities facing the industrial community and continues to bring back insights and lessons learned from the field. About 6 years ago, Dragos identified 4 key findings that we continue to track year over year. So I'm going to jump right in to our discussions and hear our panel's thoughts and recommendations on each one of these 4 findings. The first one up is limited or no visibility in OT. So network visibility focuses on an awareness of assets and their communications, and it's important to ensure that any rogue assets or improper communications are not occurring in our OT environments. In 2022, we uncovered that about 80% of our service engagements did have limited to no visibility in their ICS environments. Hussein, in the past, we've linked poor visibility to significant delays in incident response. As a responder yourself, do you have any examples of this from last year?
Well, so one example that we did have was pertaining to wastewater recycling and such. And so incidents, generally speaking, within operational technology lead to themes that border on things like loss of view, inability to control. And what we're starting to see now, especially, and Sumi can add a bit more detail in a second, is the IT-OT convergence. Because it used to be old practice where like OT was completely segregated from other networks. But now what we're starting to see is that the general way to access OT environments is via IT. And so due to this convergence, it leads to easier lateral movement because, for example, IT and OT in some cases share domain controllers, which is an issue because you can recycle credentials. And of course, this leads completely to the theme of network visibility and the concept of passive network introspection, which naturally segues into the Dragos platform, because you can generally find quite a lot of issues within an OT environment by deploying our sensors. And so you can see marked departures from the norm where there's something from OT reaching out to IT, et cetera. But the bottom line is that because of core perimeter security and IT-OT convergence, you tend to see a lot of downtime because if you have a ransomware attack that starts on the IT side, tends to spill over onto the OT side. I'm going to hand it over to Sumi to kind of, conclude.
Thanks, Hussein. So as a penetration tester, what we see is the lack of visibility is immensely useful for us during our engagements. Because as a penetration tester, all the activities that we do in a client's environment is inherently very noisy. So any sort of enumeration that we do, be it network-based or host-based, is bound to generate a lot of traffic, a lot of logs. So for example, if we use something like a sharp hound to enumerate Active Directory or run a basic Nmap scan, so all of this is going to generate a whole bunch of traffic in the environment. And if the client has weak or bad visibility, then it just makes our job of poking, probing in the environment go undetected, right? And eventually this could help us reach the crown jewel asset and possibly enumerate even more assets in the environment. So overall, this gives us penetration testers plenty of time, plenty of opportunity to move laterally within the environment, reach the crown jewel assets, and show our process impacts. And quite often we are able to do this in an engagement. So lack of visibility definitely helps us and adversaries in performing our tasks. I'll pass it back to you, Chrissy.
Thanks, Sumi. So I'm interested, Eric, from the OT Watch team, how important is visibility in threat hunting? Could you elaborate a little bit on some of the tuning that you do to our customer platforms to facilitate your hunting?
Yeah, thanks, Chrissy. Visibility is essential. It's difficult to hunt for threats when you have limited visibility into an environment. And it's critical to have adequate sensor and logging coverage of your ingress and egress conduits like firewalls or core switches. But it's also extremely helpful to not just see north to south communication, but also the east to west communication within subnets so that we're able to better see lateral movements and see any other intrazone activities associated with adversary tactics and techniques. And the same goes for an OT Watch perspective. The better visibility that we have into a client network, the more likely that we can find evidence of adversary activities across a spectrum of kill chain events, especially at those lower level subnets containing critical process related devices. And to your question about tuning and facilitating hunts, we utilize the Dragos platform, asset characterizations and visual zoning configurations to gather more context of the environment. And in tandem with these automatic characterizations, asset inventories or network diagrams. So in all, the visibility allows us to gain richer context into the environment, identify those critical assets or crown jewels, and identify potential attack paths to focus our hunts on those most critical areas of the network.
Okay, so gaining visibility when you maybe don't have any or very little seems like a really big task, especially to our asset owners. Marcus, how would you suggest they start their visibility journey, and what approach should they take to continually build upon that?
Yeah, definitely. So a lot of times we recommend that whoever's looking into visibility and environment really does understand a bit about the industrial process. Understanding those components that are going to be most critical to that process, critical to the process operation and critical to safety. A lot of times we'll refer to that as the crown jewels. And that's where we really want to focus the first part of visibility. If we're looking at one segment, that's where we're going to put visibility. Looking at ingress points in your environment, how remote access is coming in, how file moves are coming in, all of those areas are really important. And although network visibility is really the best way to gain visibility in an environment, least impact, it has the broadest range of view within an environment, there are other ways to do it. And native functionality in a lot of our tools, a lot of logging, PLCs, RTUs, all those devices tend to now have logging, and enabling that and gaining that into your environment, gaining that view into your environment is also critical.
Thank you, Marcus. So I'm going to switch over to our next finding, poor security perimeters. So we reported that 50% of our service engagement clients identified issues with network segmentation. We're seeing a direct connection between OT assets and business network segments. Implementing effective network segmentation is critical for defensible network architecture. Eric, what are some of the most common examples of poor security perimeters?
Yeah, we've observed similar examples of poor security perimeters and controls in both our professional service engagements and through OT Watch threat hunting. Some of these may include areas of opportunity for improvement relating to firewall rules, which can often negate other segmentation efforts. And this can also include commonly exploited network protocols crossing trust boundaries and leaving critical devices exposed to attacks. Another one is flat OT networks. For example, there is no significant segmentation past the IT-OT boundary firewall, which creates a massive exposure where devices at that boundary can communicate all the way down to critical process components. Or say no segmentation between different control network zones, which increases a potential target area. And then lastly, a good example would be it's not uncommon to see internet connections into OT environments, including like actual internet browsing. So these are just a few of those poor security perimeters we've seen in our engagements.
Thank you. So I'm really curious if there are certain verticals doing really well, moving in the right direction, or are we seeing some struggle more than others? Marcus, could you answer that?
Yeah, definitely. So the regulated industries tend to do better as a whole, and there's always, outliers, but regulated, think like electric with NERC in North America, or in Europe, the regulations, pipeline with TSA, they do a lot better as a whole. Areas where we see a lot of challenges are a lot of manufacturing, and we see a lot of activity in that space with adversaries, a lot of ransomware. If you look at year in review, there's a lot of ransomware within manufacturing specifically. And then we're seeing more response on the defenders. Sometimes it's with leaders in that space making an investment, but a lot of times we're seeing organizations make that investment after an incident and having to kind of clean up after the fact.
Okay. So I'm going to skip along a little bit to our third finding, external connections to OT. We define external connections as any internet protocol or asset that's communicating beyond predefined security perimeters, or any communication that's originating from a remote location and outside the company boundaries, such as a third-party vendor. It's also pretty common for any OT provider to have these external connections for maybe employees, integrators, OEMs, or the vendors to facilitate required work tasks. We did see a significant improvement last year with the external connections to OT. It dropped from 70% to 53%. Eric, does the OT Watch perform threat hunts related to remote access? And if so, could you speak to which kind?
Yeah, Chrissy, absolutely. Remote access is always a concern for the OT Watch team, and it's something we commonly hunt for. And while we're primarily using the Dragos platform and it has detections that exist for alerting on remote access, we do hunt for outliers in that remote access activity. So this could include remote access protocols or applications direct to OT via external entities that are not part of the organization. In other words, originating from the internet. This could also be remote access to critical devices like domain controllers and engineering workstations, looking for outliers there. And then we've also hunted for application-specific activities. We all know TeamViewer, similar to the old Smart incident in 2021, or even looking at potentially unauthorized access to GE components via Atlanta Data Highway. So remote access, it's such a common attack vector. And so we are continuing to build and execute threat hunts around that kind of activity.
Okay. I think this might be a great time for us to take a moment and try to understand multi-factor authentication and why it's important. Curtis, could you help us with that?
Absolutely, Chrissy. And as most on the call are probably aware, multi-factor authentication has become a much more integrated part of our day-to-day lives, particularly in the last 5 years with the advent of mobile verification through your smartphone. Obviously through the pandemic, many of us were working remotely as well. So having to factor that type of connectivity into our day-to-day lives played a role. But if there is anyone on the call who may not be familiar, multi-factor authentication mechanisms add additional factors to the authentication process, typically combining something something that's common for all of us, username and password, or some set of user credential with something you have, a key fob, a token, or a mobile device, as I mentioned, and something that you are, whether that's from a fingerprint perspective, iris scan, voice matching, things of that nature. These mechanisms have been widely deployed across enterprise environments and IT systems for some time, but only recently are we starting to consider their adoption into an OT environment. Typically, it's been a very common challenge to integrate this type of security control in an OT environment due to the amount of vendor support requirements, the unique network protocols and traffic that are in play within an OT environment, and of course, the focus on availability and safety primarily in that environment as well. The exception to remote access into OT is if it's properly deployed following a best practice, it's typically found at the boundary between the IT and OT network. Typically, this is an OT DMZ network, for example, and it's often provided through a bastion host or a secure terminal server. MFA at this level is a little bit more flexible in its implementation. Again, we're moving away from the deeper levels of the control system, getting closer to that IT-OT boundary. And there's a bit of nuance to this, of course. We have to look at what network segmentation is in place, what authentication mechanisms do we have available to us, and of course, as with any decision that's made, we need to have a confident understanding of what the overall risk is to the environment. But the benefit itself cannot be argued where it is required. What we see, one of the most common tactics, techniques, and procedures used by threat actors today for initial access and then for further privilege once they have access to an environment, including in ransomware cases, is credential compromise. And multi-factor authentication plays a key role in mitigating that attack vector and would be strongly recommended for any remote connections required into an OT environment, particularly if those connections are landing on what we would consider crown jewel assets within the control system.
Okay. Hussein, are there any best practices for third-party vendors like system integrators when they need to access and transfer files into the OT environments that they're supporting?
Well, I mean, transporting data in transit is obviously a very important notion. And so using secure file transfer applications with encryption is encouraged. But the main thing around the entire conversation is like third-party risk management and trusted vendor compromise. So third parties tend to have different security practices than the parent organization because, well, they're a vendor. So that may lead to collisions with corporate policies, procedures, et cetera. A few examples that I've seen in the past, extremely poor USB hygiene. Vendors, they favor efficiency, and so they're going to use the path of least resistance. They prefer convenience. And so they might have like a USB stick that happens to be on a keychain or in their pocket, et cetera, that they use to update certain systems. Well, the problem with this is that along with the ride sometimes, and we can use Stuxnet as the gold standard of that, additional parties come along for the ride and can wreak havoc within an OT environment. So how do we fix this? Well, we need to have awareness training. We need to educate our vendors, no matter how small. There has to be a third-party vetting process, and third-party risk management has to be part of the procurement process. And finally, additional compensating controls, such as like USB scanning kiosks, enterprise-wide USB blocks, things like that.
Thank you, Hussein. Earlier, Marcus mentioned something about ransomware, and I'm sure a couple people checked their bingo board off. Eric, how can ransomware in the IT network affect OT environments?
Yeah, so the poor or lack of segmentation that we mentioned earlier, it ties directly into the likelihood of ransomware propagation to OT ICS networks. And for the year in review report, the OT Watch team, we looked for insight of the likelihood of second stage ransomware progression into OT networks, and also the prevalence of cross-zone communication, or cross-subnet, more simply, which means communication from IT to OT, and then also communication pathways between those OT subnets. And to do this, we wanted to focus on Microsoft-related network communication protocols like RDP for remote access and SMB for remote file transfer, and both of which are commonly leveraged by ransomware groups for lateral movement and ransomware propagation. And what we identified is, on average, almost 500 unique source and destination pairs communicated over RDP. And again, on average, almost 1,700 source and destination pairs communicated over SMB. And then we also looked at cross-boundary communication connections using these same network protocols, and discovered that almost 7% of these host pair connections traverse directly from the enterprise IT side into OT subnets, and nearly 4% for SMB. And so following that pathway of ransomware propagation, 40% of RDP cross-zone, cross-subnet connections existed between OT zones, and 22% for SMB. So all that in short, what it showed us is that there's a significant potential for ransomware attacks to propagate from the IT side into the OT, and then also significant potential for follow-on ransomware propagation within OT networks, and therefore effectively segmenting networks and limiting these vulnerable protocols are an important control in protecting critical environments. And back to you, Chrissy.
Thank you, Eric. So I'm going to move along to our last common finding, which is shared credentials. The reuse of credentials across domains reduces a company's resiliency against attacks leveraging compromised credentials. In 2022, we had an increase to 54% of our engagements included a finding related to shared credentials. Hussein, what were some of the examples you saw last year?
Well, there's one that sticks in my mind in particular, and it comes back to IT and OT convergence. Generally speaking, IT has different practices than OT. And so one of the incidents that we responded to was IT said, okay, your security hygiene's poor, please fix. And of course, OT values availability. And so they were using poor practices such as shared credentials, local admin, all sorts of things that really makes, the hair on the back of my neck, stand on end. But, they were using shared logons, passwords, and this is an issue because when it comes to, let's say that Curtis and I are working at a site together and we're using the same shared account, and, I make a mistake and Curtis detects it. Well, there's no accountability behind it because I have plausible deniability because there are multiple people that have access to this sort of thing. There's also other things such as poor password strength, you know, poor password practice in general, writing down Post-its and whatnot. But the bottom line is that this leads to a major issue of separation of duties, which is an extremely important consideration while responding to an incident. And, you know, just to echo Curtis's point previously, I can't emphasize the importance of multi-factor authentication in the environment, because it isn't just about securing your OT environment. It's also about, or sorry, IT environment. It's also about securing your OT environment. And Sumit will, I'm going to steal a bit of his thunder, but one of the recommendations in most of my incidents, never ever have a unified domain controller across both OT and IT. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Sumit.
Thanks, Hussein. So as you alluded to, sharing of creds across IT/OT boundaries or any sort of sharing of creds within the environment is just so much good for us as penetration testers. In the pen testing world, they say getting the first credential is the hardest credential to get. But once we get those first creds, our typical methodology is just to see if we could reuse those creds across more systems in the environment. And if it's just the same passwords used across many systems, it just makes our jobs of moving laterally within the environment or pivoting across network boundaries so much easier. And as you alluded to, the local administrator password. So by far, that is one of the most important credential we try to go after during in an engagement, because these local administrative passwords are sometimes give us full access on that particular workstation and machine. And it is not uncommon to see that these are the same across several systems or several workstations, and including servers in the environment. So and it's especially dangerous if it's across IT/OT boundaries. And one of our top recommendations in our reports is to have a solution that is able to manage these local admin passwords on your endpoint workstations, on your servers regularly with good password strength, etc. And so one of the most common tools is Microsoft provides LAPS, and it's free and it's so easy to use that that we often recommend clients to abandon efforts to manage passwords locally through GPOs, but just trust Microsoft's LAPS as a solution. And Hussein, you just said not having common domain, separate domain controllers is really important. A lot of times we see now clients separating their corporate domain controllers, their DMZs, and their OT Active Directory domains. So this is a really good design that we strongly encourage in environments, especially OT environments. But still, there is a chance that someone or some user who has accounts on multiple domains may use the same passwords across these domains, and that can be problematic as well. So as Curtis and Hussein said, having multi-factor authentication, especially across IT/OT boundaries, is absolutely critical, so that a credential compromise at a higher layer does not allow an adversary or a pen tester to pivot across network boundaries. So back to you, Chrissy.
Thanks, Sumit. I'm going to pivot a little bit after discussing these 4 year in review trends. So Curtis, I'm gonna ask you a couple questions here, because I'm really interested on how asset owners that are falling under industry regulations compare to the broader OT community based on assessments that we've performed.
Absolutely, Chrissy. And 2022 saw a fair bit of activity, particularly from the TSA, in both the release of version 02C of Security Directive targeting pipelines in July, and then Security Directive 1580/82 that was targeting rail operators that was released in October of 2022. For pipeline asset owners, the release of version 2C marked a shift away from what was previously perceived as a very prescriptive approach, very narrow approach to the application of the Security Directive, to a more performance-based and outcome approach, which provided a lot more flexibilities for asset owners to implement controls to satisfy the requirements of the directive. On the rail side, the benefits that rail got to experience was utilizing some of those lessons learned from the pipeline industry. They were able to use that directive, or the base set of directives, as a foundation in developing the rail-focused directives, with the obvious differences being included for the difference in the 2 verticals. From the data that we collected and gathered on the engagements that we executed with primarily pipeline asset owners because they're a little bit farther on the curve than the rail industry is. As with any regulatory standards such as NERC-CIP, the TSA, once you're pushed in that direction, it's a little bit more of a motivating factor to start implementing some controls. So overall, we did notice an increase in maturity from a pipeline perspective compared to the overall OT industry verticals. From a visibility perspective, that is the one area where, as we've mentioned multiple times on this call, it has remained a challenge. However, we did notice an improvement compared to OT in general with these asset owners. From a shared credentials perspective, we also saw an improvement, and we are trending towards above industry average there. And overall, I believe I just have the one other finding I have to go to. I've talked about external connections, network visibility, shared credentials, and poor security perimeters is the last one. We also see an improvement in that regard as well. But as I mentioned, regulation really helps provide the motivation, if you will, to start moving down our direction. So again, overall, we did see an improvement across all four of those areas, targeting those regulated industries. Again, primarily based on those that we worked with on the pipeline side of things. The rail industry is a little bit farther behind the curve. Right now, they are currently in the window of submitting cybersecurity implementation plans. Those were to be delivered to the TSA in February 2023. So our hope is that we will have a broader perspective as we move into next year's findings as well.
Thank you, Curtis. So given the recent focus from TSA on the rail industry, Simi, could you talk us through a recent pen test that you performed for a rail client?
Sure, Chrissy. So in October 2022, Dragos performed a pen test for a rail client. And as with most of our pen tests, this was on a live production environment. And so typically when we do see these pen tests, we follow a highly collaborative approach. Essentially all throughout the engagement, beginning of the engagement, we work closely with the clients. And since it's production, our focus is to generally do this in an extremely safe, controlled manner, right? And so for this particular engagement, there were essentially two objectives. So the first objective was starting from the IT network and moving laterally through the IT network and then pivoting across to the OT boundary. And the second was once inside the OT boundary to see if we could reach any crown jewel assets in the environment. So essentially, starting from the IT environment, when we started the engagement, we quickly found interesting misconfigurations. So the first one being there were a lot of mapped shared drives, and these were open with a lot of files and folders, and anyone could read the information on them and possibly write to them as well. We also found not good Active Directory hygiene, since a lot of users in the environment were actually a local administrator on several systems. So basically what we did was, since it's there, we just move laterally to these systems and dump the local administrator creds on these machines. We also found a lot of users had the ability to use remote desktop protocol, which is inbuilt. And so it's convenient, and we could RDP into several workstations in the environment. So again, these are bad practices, and routinely auditing your Active Directory environment for misconfigurations, excess privileges is really important and is a very common vector of compromise. So on one of these RDP'd assets, we found a domain admin logged in, and we also found patches missing since a few years ago. And this just helped us to escalate locally and steal the creds for the domain admin and eventually basically own the entire IT domain. The second part of the engagement was if we could traverse laterally through the OT network. And we again began a cycle of enumeration, checking if there are any open files and shares, testing for missing patches. Here in the OT environment, we had a really interesting observation. So this environment was extremely big and had a lot of jump hosts, but there was one particular jump host that was actually misconfigured with outbound internet access. And we saw this while we were replaying the PCAPs using the power of the Dragos platform. And once we saw this, we got suspicious of the possibilities of abusing this jump host. And so we immediately were able to set up a command and control channel and totally bypass all the previous connections. So instead of going through several hops, several IT connections to actually reach this jump host, we just had a single connection outbound to our AWS servers out in the internet. So which was pretty neat because it just helps us to evade detection on the entire path on so many different hosts in the intermediate hosts. So eventually we also saw domain admins logged into engineering workstations, which is not a great idea. And finding RDP profiles on shared drives allowed us to access crown jewel assets. So this was, in summary, the case study that we did. I think this particular engagement demonstrated how technical and non-technical vulnerabilities can actually be chained and exploited to gain access to crown jewel assets. When we do a pen test, we do it in a very safe and controlled manner. And so our task is to basically simulate the easiest or the simplest path to the crown jewel assets. And a lot of these times, these paths involve simple misconfigurations. We hardly, if ever, scan or do any sort of Nmap scanning or those sort of stuff in the environment. So we keep looking for non-technical vulnerabilities like RDP profiles on a machine, or something useful on the shared drive, or something useful on the SharePoint. So that's why I think it's really important for clients to do penetration testing, because sometimes these vulnerabilities may not be fully captured in a vulnerability assessment. So Chrissy, that was the case study. I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you very much for going through that in detail. So Samit, you were discussing about taking steps to security environments. I'm gonna switch back over to Curtis and ask him what's next for the asset owners that are in scope of TSA.
So our general recommendation, both for the pipeline asset owners and for rail asset owners that fall under compliance of the TSA directives, are to continue to review their cybersecurity implementation plans. Our recommendation would be at least once per year. The frequency can shift depending on a personal preference, but at least once per year. We want to make sure that we're reviewing those implementation plans so that we are validating that the security controls are in place, are adequate for the current threat landscape, and make updates where required. Both directives do have established processes and timelines for how those updates are made and communicated to the TSA. For asset owners that are wishing to assess the effectiveness of their cybersecurity incident response plans that they've developed under these security directives, tabletop exercises are a very effective means for testing response activities as well as coordination capabilities against a simulated threat scenario and capturing lessons learned to factor in and improve existing IR processes. And on the flip side, if it's more of a technical control or technical controls that we wish to assess, penetration tests can also be strongly considered to assess the effectiveness of those technical controls. And then lastly, specifically to rail, now that we're in the window of cybersecurity implementation plans have been submitted, there is a requirement from the TSA where a cybersecurity architecture design review or a CADR, as it's been defined in the latest set of security directives, also known as a VADR, we use them interchangeably. That does need to be completed no later than 12 months from the approval of your submitted cybersecurity implementation plans. So just some things to be mindful of there.
Great. So you mentioned tabletop exercises for testing incident response activities. Hussein, what is a tabletop exercise and why should everyone perform them?
So in plain English, a tabletop exercise is literally witnessing an incident before it happens. It's the worst day in the office. It's recreating an event within the organization, but it's in a safe, non-attributable environment. And the purpose is to improve the knowledge and overall education and awareness level within the responding team. Think of it as like a dress rehearsal. So this gives us two benefits. First, you're validating your processes, your procedures, and your people. But secondary to that, you're also finding points of improvement, or if your team knocks it out of the park, you're performing a validation and making sure that you can demonstrate to your leadership and to your board and all those other people that make decisions that you're able to respond to an incident in a way that is, documented, defined, and reproducible. Over to Marcus as far as tabletops, because of course he's my counterpart.
Yeah, so having done a lot of tabletops this year, I think one of the biggest takeaways is that those that practice are going to do better. And the other big takeaway is, incident response and running these tabletops, it's really a team effort, and getting the people involved that are going to be involved in an incident response is critical. A lot of times when we run tabletops, of course, they're focused on the industrial environment. We're bringing it together, plant managers, operators, engineers, and we're bringing them together with a lot of times the IT staff or the security staff. Sometimes that's the first time they're really interacting and working together on something. And that really does open those doors, builds those bridges. And during a real incident, those are the people that are really going to be important because they understand the industrial process. They understand how to safely operate. Over to you, Christy.
Thanks. So we have talked quite a bit about our findings from previous years, and I'd like to change our focus towards the recommendations for 2023 and beyond. SANS Institute identified 5 critical controls for ICS OT cybersecurity. Curtis, what are the 5 critical controls and why should we use them?
Thank you, Chrissy. As everyone can see, the 5 critical controls are shown on the slide at the moment, but the overall intent of these controls are meant to serve as an answer to that frustrated organization request of just tell us what to do. We can't do everything immediately. We are not sure where to start. Which path can we start looking down? And these controls include consideration for crown jewel assets within a facility. They're intended to, again, be a little bit more focused around outcomes as opposed to being prescriptive in nature. And they're also intelligence driven in that they've been chosen specifically based on the analysis of recent compromises and attacks in industrial companies around the world. I want to shift gears quickly. I know we're not quite at Q&A yet, but there was a great question that was asked when I was talking about the TSA directives around, doesn't performance-based also mean, or doesn't outcome-based also mean a little bit more subjectivity and less guidance? So a bit of a wider net to cast as opposed to more of a narrow focus, making things a little bit more of a check-the-box exercise and reducing the effectiveness of the security control. And that is absolutely true. The challenge is when we get to a too prescriptive application of control, you again narrow the focus and have the opportunity to introduce paralysis in making a decision. Taking more of an outcome focused approach, again, allows organizations to cast a wider net, is more applicable to the unique environments that we're typically dealing with OT customers. And it allows progress to be made in some way, shape, or form, as opposed to, again, suffering from paralysis, as I mentioned before. For sectors with no regulation, the 5 controls, again, allow that more programmatic approach of understanding the overall risk faced by OT assets and allow organizations to deploy effective security controls that reduce or eliminate impact operations while following within an acceptable risk tolerance. And then for organizations that are subject to regulation, whether it's through the TSA or NERC-CIP, to go back to the question that I mentioned earlier, this gives you the capability to go beyond what is prescribed in the regulatory requirement to, again, improve overall OT cybersecurity posture beyond what is required by a regulatory standard or requirement. One thing that's important to note here as a theme throughout this set of conversations that I'm providing is it's okay to feel if you're behind or lagging in the development of your own OT cybersecurity maturity and capabilities. The controls that have been released by SANS, again, are meant to provide that guidance based on real world analysis and offer you a starting point and a pathway to follow. And a lot of what we do as part of our mission at Dragos is directed towards supporting customers along that OT cybersecurity journey, both through the execution of engagements as well as through extensive outreach, such as this meeting today.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask one last question, and then we're going to jump into our Q&A portion. So the 5 CCs, it can be a lot to digest. Marcus, are the controls prioritized?
Yes, and really what it comes down to, in the past, we've always focused on defense, putting a perimeter around things, building up defense. And honestly, that just hasn't worked very well. We still have security incidents. And so if you're starting from scratch, or even if you're not starting from scratch, you really need to think about when the event happens, not if, because it is going to happen. I mean, look at ransomware today. How many industries are getting hit by ransomware and the increase we're seeing. And so if you start with, hey, I'm going to build a plan for incident response, start there, and then start building your defense. And a lot of the things as you build that incident response, you're doing it from an intelligence perspective. You're building specific plans for ransomware, for example. You're going to use that to inform defensible architecture. You're going to use that to understand where you need visibility to detect that, and so on and so on. And it really does drive down the line all the way through the prioritized list.
Great, thank you. A big thank you to the panelists. This was extremely informative. And now we have a lot of great questions from the audience today. And I am going to start off with one for Hussein. What are your thoughts on active asset discovery versus passive?
So it all comes back to the whole IT versus OT analogy. Generally within IT, there's a lot of discovery that happens in an active manner. But because in OT, you really don't want to do that. Because there are legacy systems, you might be running with resource constraints, issues such as that. And so passive is definitely favored. And that's kind of where, Stage Right, Dragos platform comes into the view, because passive network introspection is so very important, because active scanning will disrupt the availability of OT networks in some scenarios.
Thanks, Hussein. Our next question, Marcus, can you provide insights into the latest trends in ransomware attacks and strategies for preventing and responding to them?
Yeah, at Dragos, I mean, we put a lot of focus on tracking ransomware. We put out a quarterly report that's available on our website, and we also have a large section in the year in review. We tracked 57 different ransomware groups, I think it was last year, saw an increase of 87% of attacks with ransomware. And every industry really needs to consider ransomware. You should have a playbook. You should have an incident response for it. And that's probably the biggest recommendation. Build a playbook, build a incident response plan that specifically has that, and run a tabletop exercise and make those decisions, because when it happens to you, and it is a when, you really want to have all those things lined up. Ransomware too tends to have some long dwell times in industrial environments, so having visibility can help a lot. And then just the rest of the 5 critical controls, I will say, are critical to securing yourself or trying to prevent the impact as much as you can.
Thank you. Here's an interesting one. I believe this one, Samit, you might be best to answer this. What are some of the favorite TTPs that were used by the pen testing team on that engagement?
Sure, Chrissy. So at Dragos, we did recently a review of all the TTPs that we have had most success in the past 3 to 4 years. The truth is, every engagement is different, and some of our tooling has needed to be adapted over the years. But our focus for all engagements is to do our testing in a very safe and controlled manner. So last year, what we observed that in a lot of our engagements, we were using RDP, or remote desktop protocol, for lateral movement, and sometimes even for pivoting across network boundaries. And we would find RDP profiles on the machine or the workstation which we are on, or on a shared drive, or sometimes we would perform a machine in the middle attack, or use RDP hijacking solutions to gain RDP cred. So this has been quite successful in the last year, because we have been trying to use more native tools. And the other thing that we see is in an environment, we typically do not do scanning because it's detrimental to scan OT environments. So what we do is we spend a lot of time doing slow control enumeration. We go and look at shared drives. We go and look at your SharePoints. We would go and look at any internal any internal portals that you may have. So a lot of the times we find a lot of useful information, passwords, asset listings, network diagrams, OneNotes with very detailed information just there. So we don't really need to generate any traffic. We just casually browse the environment and blend into the environment. And that also helps us to evade detection. And then finally, I would say we still see clients having issues with their Active Directory setup. So we constantly encourage clients to review their setups, because Active Directory is a huge attack surface area. So in summary, 3 top ones: RDP related, just plain reconnaissance, enumeration, and Active Directory hygiene. So these would be the top 3 TTPs that I would say. Back to you, Chrissy.
Thank you, Samit. Eric, Is the Dragos platform used primarily for threat hunting or OT threat monitoring or both?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the primary use case for the Dragos platform and something we highlight in the year in review report is that visibility. The platform can be used for identifying assets in your network, identifying communication between those assets and between network zones. However, in addition to providing additional network visibility or asset identification, there are threat analytics that are in the platform and are continually updated in the platform to alert on possible suspicious or, if not malicious threat activity that may require further investigation. So starting with increased asset identification and in tandem with threat detection analytics, yes, the platform can be used for threat monitoring as well. But also, yes, the platform can be used for threat hunting. And we have several customers with dedicated OT security teams that utilize the platform for this purpose. But again, our goal, me and my team's goal on the OT Watch team is to help augment OT or IT security teams to monitor threats in those OT networks and provide suspicious findings or even poor security controls to customers as they come up. Back to you, Chrissy.
Thank you. All right, another question. In a mixed environment, how do you tell that the IT-OT communications are reaching across boundaries? Is this something you tune or learn? Do you automatically zone using IEC 62443 for an asset owner? Curtis, is this something that you can answer for us?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a fantastic it's a fantastic question rather. And it's a little bit of both. So in order for us to have the capability to tune, we first need to understand what our overall baseline is. So the initial exercise that needs to be undertaken is understanding from an operational perspective what data flows and communication is required from OT into the enterprise level, whether it's sharing to an enterprise level historian, for example. Having that initial understanding allows us to establish, again, that baseline so that as we move through and expand, whether it's adding new network segments, adding additional applications into the OT environment, or making changes to existing OT applications in the environment, we have the baseline that we can work from. And then based on that, we can tune data flows, communication requirements, and the logging necessary to capture them as we move forward. ISA IEC 62443 does a fantastic job in explaining it. It's very broadly understood from establishing the zone and conduit model. From a regulatory perspective, I think NERC does it very well as well, in that you have to have a defined list of services, ports, and applications that are required for operations to occur, and that has to be documented. But regardless, once that baseline is established and the tuning is in place, any changes within the OT environment should also be factored into your overall change management processes so that we are identifying new application data flows or altering existing application data flows based on that change management process to ensure that we're capturing the required communications and then alerting on any suspicious or unexpected behavior communications that are being identified egress of the OT network.
Okay, thank you very much, Curtis. Another question from our audience. Marcus, how do large companies with many unique manufacturing sites begin improving their OT visibility without creating products like documentation that are so large it becomes unusable?
Yeah, so usually when we look at a large organization and they're starting their journey, one of the first things we're going to do is do a crown jewel analysis. We're going to do it on a system level. So you can actually sit down and there's a white paper that Dragos has out there. It's linked off our site. I would highly recommend you go look at it. But you basically look at what are your critical manufacturing sites. Start with those and then do a crown jewel analysis of those. So a system and system approach to really figure out exactly which sites and which systems in those sites are critical. Adding visibility there. That whole journey, though, you really do need to build a program. So I don't think there's really a way not to build documentation. It definitely needs to be manageable, and developing a program and teams to support that along with the technology is critical to that. And the best approach really is to look at those most critical sites and look at what risks you have within your environment. Back to you, Chrissy.
Thank you. Okay, we have time for a few more questions. Hussein, here's an interesting one that I think you might be able to answer. Why do we need an incident response retainer? Can't we just call when and if we have an incident?
My favorite question. So ideally, you want things in place before something happens. You don't want to be negotiating an incident response retainer or trying to hire an incident response team in the middle of a crisis. It is an extremely stressful point in time, and to have everything well prepared ahead and in advance is something that I tell every single one of my clients, where you just simply don't want to do that. And the thing is that there are a lot more cybersecurity incidents this year than there were the last or the year before, for that matter. And so firms might actually be busy. And so, you know, having that in place is extremely important.
Great, thank you. Here's another good one. I've heard the term crown jewels mentioned throughout the call. What are crown jewels? Curtis, could you take that question?
Yeah, absolutely, Chrissy. Crown jewels is a term that we use at Dragos to represent those assets within a customer environment that are critical to the overall operation of the OT network. So assets that, if compromised or rendered unavailable, would significantly impact either the functional output of a facility, or worst case scenario, pose a significant risk to health and safety of either site personnel or the general public. Following a process similar to a business impact analysis or business impact assessment, identification of these assets is necessary to ensure that adequate and risk-based security controls can be implemented to properly protect a customer's OT environment.
Thank you so much, Curtis. I think we have time for one more question. Let's see here. What is the most common security issue you're seeing in customer environments? Marcus, would you like to take that one?
Yeah, definitely. I think a lot of times what we see is a lack of understanding and a lack of visibility. And I'm going to kind of put those in two contexts. So lack of understanding, a lot of times you'll have security teams that are, trying to do their best and trying to apply security to these environments, which is critical, but they sometimes don't understand how these environments operate. Understand the assets within them. They don't have the relationships with operations. And so building that is really critical. And then lack of visibility, we run across this a lot where, they really don't know the assets, sometimes even on the operation side. Maybe they've been there, for 20 years and they don't understand the system fully, from the assets have been there a long time. Something like the Dragos platform can really help with that. And it can be used by both sides. And we've seen a lot of success when an organization, both on the security side and the operations side, adopts the Dragos platform. And then they can start having conversations together and work together. And it can have a ton of operational benefits for the ops side. And then security, I mean, it's an obvious benefit on their side when they start being able to see that environment and understand it.
Thanks, Marcus. So we're nearly at the top of the hour. I would like to thank everyone for their time today. We had some amazing questions from our participants, and I really appreciate everyone on the panel, your time today, all of your insight. I recommend reading the full year report for more information if you haven't already. And we thank everyone on this call for doing their part to protect their communities by working to better secure our critical infrastructures. And with that, we will see each of you guys out there in the field. Take care, and I hope you have a great Tuesday.